My wife said to her mother, "I don't think this marriage will last another month. He's ugly to look at. I'd rather kiss my dog than to sleep with me." They both laughed in agreement. I smiled. Why wait a month? Let's end it now. Then I left. That night, her sister sent a message that made my hands freeze. Look, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Wednesday is the worst day of the week, because that would be giving Wednesday way too much credit for originality. Wednesday is just Tuesday's uglier cousin who showed up uninvited to the week and decided to overstay its welcome. But this particular Wednesday, this godforsaken hump day that tasted like burnt coffee and broken promises, this Wednesday at exactly 6:47 p.m., was about to become the most significant Wednesday of my entire 32 years on this increasingly disappointing planet. I'd just finished a double shift at Morrison's warehouse, which is a fancy way of saying I'd spent 16 hours lifting boxes that weighed more than my self-esteem and smelled like a mixture of industrial cleaner in someone's grandmother's attic. My back was screaming in languages I didn't know existed. My hands were rough enough to sand down furniture, and I'm pretty sure I'd sweated out about 70% of my body weight. The warehouse was one of those places where the air conditioning was more of a suggestion than an actual feature, and the fluorescent lights flickered just enough to make you question whether you were working or auditioning for a low-budget horror movie. But hey, the paycheck cleared every 2 weeks, and in this economy, that's practically winning the lottery. I pulled into the driveway of our modest 2-bedroom rental house in a neighborhood that real estate agents generously called up and coming, which is code for the Starbucks hasn't arrived yet, but give it 5 years and maybe you'll break even. The house was painted this weird shade of beige that I'm convinced was specifically designed to make you feel nothing, absolutely nothing, every time you looked at it. We'd been living there for 3 years, Marissa and I, trying to save up for something better, something that didn't have a kitchen faucet that leaked every time Mercury was in retrograde, or whatever astrological excuse we were using that month. I grabbed my lunchbox from the passenger seat, the one with my name written in Sharpie on the side like I was still in 3rd grade, and hauled my exhausted carcass out of my 10-year-old Honda Civic that made concerning noises every time I went over 15 miles per hour. The car and I had an understanding, though. I didn't ask it to be reliable, and it didn't ask me to trade it in for something that didn't sound like a dying robot every time I hit the gas pedal. Fair trade. As I approached the front door, fishing around in my pocket for keys that always seemed to migrate to the most inconvenient location possible, I could already hear voices coming from inside. My wife Marissa and her mother Judith were having one of their marathon gabfests, which typically involved wine, gossip, and a level of judgment that could peel paint off walls. Now, I want to be clear about something right from the start. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I wasn't being one of those creepy husbands who lurks around corners trying to catch his wife in some scandalous revelation. I literally just have good hearing and the unfortunate habit of existing in my own house at inopportune moments. I slid the key into the lock as quietly as possible, not because I was sneaking, but because Judith had this thing about men stomping around like elephants, and I'd learned over the years that sometimes the path of least resistance involved pretending you were a ninja entering your own home. The door creaked open, because of course it did. The landlord had been meaning to fix that for approximately 18 months, and I stepped into the small entryway, setting my lunchbox down on the table we'd picked up from IKEA during a sale that Marissa had insisted would change our lives. Spoiler alert, it didn't, but it did hold our mail and my lunchbox, so I guess it was fulfilling some kind of purpose. That's when I heard it. Crystal clear. No ambiguity whatsoever. Marissa's voice, the same voice that had said, "I do" for years ago in a ceremony at the community center that cost more than our first car, was floating through the living room with all the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. "Mom, I don't think this marriage is going to last another month, honestly. I mean, he's just... God. He's so ugly to look at sometimes. Like, I literally can't even. I'd rather kiss my dog than sleep with him at this point." And then came the sound that really sealed the deal, the cherry on top of this disaster Sunday, Judith's laugh. Not a polite chuckle, not an uncomfortable clearing of the throat, but a full-throated, genuine laugh. The kind of laugh you hear at comedy clubs when the headliner lands a particularly good punchline. My mother-in-law was laughing at the idea of her daughter preferring to make out with a Labrador retriever named Biscuit rather than engage in any form of physical intimacy with her husband. With me, the guy who'd just worked a double shift, so we could afford the organic dog food that Biscuit apparently required for his sensitive stomach. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds, which is about how long it takes for your entire perception of reality to shift from, "I'm tired, but I have a home and a marriage," to, "I'm tired and apparently losing a popularity contest to a golden retriever." My brain went through several stages very quickly: shock, denial, anger, and then landed on something I wasn't expecting: clarity. Pure, undiluted, almost refreshing clarity. I didn't storm in. I didn't throw things. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply walked into the living room where both of them were sitting on our secondhand couch, wine glasses in hand, looking for all the world like they were having the time of their lives, roasting me like I was a celebrity at a Comedy Central special. Marissa's eyes went wide when she saw me, and I watched in real time as her face went from relaxed and happy to the kind of pale you usually associate with people who've just seen a ghost or realized they left the oven on. Judith, to her credit, at least had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable, though I suspect that had more to do with being caught than any actual remorse. I smiled. Not a fake smile, not a bitter smile, but genuinely smiled, because suddenly everything made sense in a way it hadn't for months. All those nights of excuses, all those times she'd flinched when I tried to touch her hand, all those conversations that died the moment I entered the room. It all clicked into place like the world's most depressing puzzle. "Well," I said, my voice calm and steady in a way that surprised even me. "Why wait a month? Let's just end it now. Saves time, saves energy, and honestly, saves money on dog treats since Biscuit apparently has a competitor for your affection." The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I'm pretty sure I could hear the neighbor's cat judging us from 2 houses away. Marissa's mouth opened and closed like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land and was having serious regrets about its life choices. Judith blinked repeatedly, her eyes going wide and then wider, like an owl that had just been confronted with a philosophical question it wasn't prepared to answer. I grabbed my keys from where I'd just set them down, did a little mock salute that I'd definitely seen in some movie and couldn't quite place, and delivered my exit line with the kind of timing that would have made a sitcom writer proud. "Enjoy your mother-daughter roast session, ladies. Don't wait up." And then I walked out of that beige house, got into my dying Honda Civic, and drove away, feeling oddly proud of my one-liner delivery and surprisingly calm about the fact that my marriage had just imploded over a comparison to a dog named Biscuit. Wednesday, man. What a day. So here's the thing about making dramatic exits from your own marriage. Nobody really prepares you for the logistics of where you're supposed to go afterward. It's not like they have a handbook titled, "So Your Wife Compared You to a Dog, a Practical Guide to Emergency Housing." I drove around for about 20 minutes, which in retrospect was probably 15 minutes longer than necessary, but I was running on pure adrenaline and the fumes of righteous indignation, and those don't exactly come with a GPS feature. I ended up at the Sunset Vista Motel, which was aggressively misnamed considering there was no vista. The sunset was blocked by a billboard advertising personal injury lawyers, and calling it a motel was being generous to establishments everywhere. The neon sign out front flickered between vacant Y and complete darkness, which I chose to interpret as a metaphor for my current life situation rather than a commentary on the electrical system. The place cost $49 a night, and I'm pretty convinced that price point included an unspoken agreement that I wouldn't ask questions about the stains or the previous occupants. The guy at the front desk looked like he'd seen every variation of human despair and had long since stopped being impressed by any of it. He had a magnificent mustache that seemed to have its own personality and a name tag that said Earl, though he never confirmed whether that was actually his name or just something the previous Earl had left behind. I handed over my credit card, the one that was just mine, thank God, not the joint account that I was suddenly viewing with deep suspicion, and he slid me a physical key attached to a plastic diamond-shaped keychain with the room number printed on it. "Checkout's at 11, Earl said, his voice suggesting he'd said this exact sentence approximately 40,000 times and had stopped carrying around occurrence number 12. "Ice machine's broken. Vending machine takes dollar bills but doesn't give change, and if you hear screaming, it's probably the cat that lives in the walls." "There's a cat in the walls?" I asked, because apparently that was the detail my brain decided to focus on. Earl shrugged with the kind of profound indifference that comes from years of motel management. Allegedly. Room 237. And yes, I'm aware that's the room number from The Shining. And yes, that felt oddly appropriate. Was located on the second floor, accessed by an exterior staircase that creaked ominously with every step. The room itself was a masterpiece of depressing efficiency. One double bed with a comforter that had probably seen things that would make a therapist weep. A TV from sometime during the Bush administration, the first one. A bathroom the size of an airplane lavatory, and a window that overlooked the parking lot, and, beyond that, a gas station that advertised hot dogs, in letters so faded they looked like a threat rather than a promise. The entire space smelled like a combination of industrial-strength disinfectant, sadness, and what I could only describe as the tears of previous occupants who'd also made questionable life choices. There was a strange brown stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like Abraham Lincoln's profile, which felt weirdly patriotic, and the carpet had a pattern that I think was designed specifically to hide other stains, which was honestly pretty smart from a business perspective. I dropped my duffel bag, the one I'd hastily packed with whatever clothes I could grab during my dramatic exit, which turned out to be 3 t-shirts, 1 pair of jeans, 5 pairs of socks, because apparently my subconscious prioritizes foot comfort during emotional crises, and exactly 0 pairs of underwear, on the bed, and just stood there for a moment, taking in my new temporary reality. This was it. This was rock bottom, or at least rock bottom's budget accommodation. I was a 32-year-old man standing in a $49 motel room because my wife had decided I ranked below a Labrador Retriever in the attractiveness department. I should have been crying or punching walls or doing whatever it is that men are supposed to do when their marriages explode, but instead I just felt tired. Not the physical exhaustion from the double shift. That was still there, lurking in my shoulders and lower back like a persistent relative, but a deeper kind of tired that settles into your bones when you realize you've been fighting for something that the other person checked out of months ago. I lay down on the bed, which was exactly as uncomfortable as it looked, and stared at Abraham Lincoln's profile on the ceiling. "Honest, Abe," I said out loud to the empty room. "You ever get compared to a dog?" Lincoln, being a stain and also deceased, didn't respond, but I felt like he would have been on my side. That's when my phone started buzzing. And buzzing. And buzzing some more, like someone had attached it to a beehive, and then kicked the beehive while yelling insults at the bees. I pulled it out of my pocket and watched as the notifications rolled in, one after another, each one from Marissa, each one apparently more desperate than the last. "Ryan, we need to talk." That wasn't what it sounded like. "You're being dramatic." Mom was just venting, and I was agreeing to be supportive. "You can't just leave like that. This is so typical of you, running away from problems." And then, my personal favorite, "I'm your wife. You owe me a conversation." The messages kept coming, each one cycling through a greatest hits collection of manipulation tactics, guilt, anger, gaslighting, victim playing, and what I can only describe as emotional poetry that would have made Shakespeare cringe so hard his ruff would have fallen off. She went from apologizing to insulting me to apologizing for insulting me to explaining why the insults were actually my fault, all within the span of about 15 messages. It was like watching someone speedrun through every relationship red flag that exists. I sat there, phone in hand, watching the messages pile up like some kind of twisted social media feed dedicated entirely to my failed marriage. Each notification made a little ding sound that was starting to feel like water torture, and I realized with absolute clarity that I had 2 choices. I could engage with this circus, or I could put the phone down and let her scream into the void. I chose the void. The void seemed nice. The void didn't compare me to household pets. I silenced my phone and tossed it onto the nightstand, which was really just a wobbly table with delusions of grandeur. I closed my eyes and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. This morning, I'd woken up as a married man with a routine and a life that, while not perfect, was at least familiar. Now I was lying in a motel room that possibly contained a wall cat, staring at ceiling Lincoln, while my wife had a meltdown via text message. The universe, I decided, had a truly twisted sense of humor. Just when I thought maybe I could actually fall asleep despite the suspiciously lumpy mattress and the sound of someone's TV blaring through the wall, my phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't Marissa's name on the screen. It was her sister, Heather. Now, Heather and I had always had a weird relationship. She was 3 years younger than Marissa, worked in social media marketing, and had the kind of personality that could only be described as chaos with good intentions. She made memes for a living, had opinions about everything, and was the family member who always said the quiet part loud at Thanksgiving dinner. Marissa found her exhausting. I found her refreshing, mainly because she was one of the few people in that family who didn't treat me like I was auditioning for the role of acceptable husband and constantly failing. Her message was short, which immediately made it more alarming than Marissa's novel-length guilt trip. Hey, you probably don't want to hear from me right now, and I totally get that. But you should really check your wife's hidden photo folder. I'm sorry. You deserve to know. I stared at that message for a long time, long enough that the screen went dark and I had to tap it back to life. Because here's the thing about messages like that, they're grenades. You know they're grenades. You can see the pin is pulled, but you also know that once you acknowledge them, once you actually look at whatever horror show is waiting in that hidden photo folder, there's no going back. Ignorance might not be bliss, but it's at least comfortable, and I was currently lying on what felt like a mattress stuffed with regret and broken springs. That line, that single sentence from Heather, made my hands freeze midair like I was in some kind of dramatic pause in a movie where the protagonist has to decide whether to open the mystery box. Except this wasn't a movie, this was my life, and the mystery box was apparently my wife's phone, and nothing good ever came from sentences that started with "you deserve to know." I set the phone down again, face up this time, Heather's message glowing in the darkness of room 237. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow I'd deal with whatever fresh hell was waiting in that hidden photo folder. Tonight, I just wanted to sleep in this sad motel room and pretend that the worst thing that had happened today was being compared to a dog. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. I didn't sleep. Let's just establish that right up front, because I'm not going to pretend I had some peaceful night of rest while processing my emotions like a well-adjusted adult in a self-help book. No, I lay there on that mattress from hell, staring at Abraham Lincoln's ceiling profile, listening to the wall cat, allegedly, and the couple next door who were either moving furniture or training for some kind of Olympic sport that involved a lot of rhythmic thumping. The motel's idea of blackout curtains was apparently fabric that exists, so the parking lot lights streamed in through the window, casting everything in this sickly orange glow that made the whole room look like it was being filmed through an Instagram filter called despair. Around 3 in the morning, after I'd mentally cataloged every stain on the ceiling and composed several imaginary speeches I'd never actually deliver, I gave up on sleep entirely. I grabbed my phone, squinted at the brightness that immediately felt like an assault on my retinas, and opened Heather's message again. It was still there, still taunting me with its existence, still promising information that I simultaneously wanted and absolutely did not want. My thumb hovered over the screen for what felt like an hour, but was probably 30 seconds. This was it, the moment of truth, the point of no return. Every cliché you can think of about crossing thresholds and opening Pandora's boxes, except this box was digital and contained my wife's betrayal in high definition. I typed back, "What am I looking at here?" The 3 dots appeared immediately, which meant Heather had also been awake at 3 in the morning, which made sense because she was basically a vampire who ran on iced coffee and internet drama. Her response came through in seconds. "Give me a minute." Sending files. And then my phone started buzzing with incoming images, one after another, like someone was feeding photos into a scanner and just letting it run. The first one loaded, and I had to blink several times to make sure I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing. It was a selfie of Marissa and Biscuit, our Labrador retriever, the same dog she'd compared me to just hours earlier. Except in this photo, she wasn't just posing with him. She was kissing him, full-on kissing him, and not like a cute, "I love my dog" peck on the forehead. No, this was tongue out, full commitment, the kind of kiss that you usually see between people who are about to be asked to get a room. Biscuit looked confused, which was honestly the most relatable thing about this entire situation. I stared at the photo for a solid minute, my brain trying to process what my eyes were showing me. For a second, I wasn't even mad. I was genuinely concerned for the dog's mental health and whether he needed therapy or at least a stronger understanding of boundaries. Who does this? Who takes a selfie making out with their dog and then saves it? What was the thought process there? Better document this moment for posterity? Was this going in the family photo album? Before I could fully unpack the psychological implications of my wife's relationship with our pet, another image loaded. Then another. Then another. It was like watching a slideshow from hell, except hell had better production values. The second photo wasn't a biscuit, which was almost a relief until I realized what I was actually looking at. It was Marissa and a guy I recognized immediately, Trent Morrison, her ex-boyfriend from college. The same Trent she'd assured me was ancient history and totally not a threat, and just a friend she occasionally texted to be polite. They were at a restaurant, a nice one, the kind with cloth napkins and entrees that cost more than my hourly wage. Marissa was wearing the blue dress I'd complimented her on last week, the one she'd said she wore to a girls' night out with her coworkers. Trent had his arm around her. She was leaning into him. They looked happy. They looked like a couple. They looked like people who definitely weren't just being polite. I checked the metadata on the photo because apparently, at 3 in the morning, I'd become a digital forensics expert. The date stamp said last Tuesday. Last Tuesday. As in 6 days ago. As in the same Tuesday, I'd worked overtime to cover the cost of the water heater that broke, while she was apparently out living her best life with Trent at what looked like Giovanni's, the Italian place downtown that required reservations and had a menu without prices, which is restaurant code for bring your wealthy uncle. The third photo was them kissing. Not the dog this time, Trent. A real, actual kiss between two people who definitely knew each other better than people who were just being polite should know each other. I laughed. Out loud. A real laugh. The kind that comes from somewhere deep in your chest when your brain short-circuits and can't figure out what other emotion to process. So it just defaults to humor, because humor is safer than acknowledging that you're looking at photographic evidence of your wife cheating on you while you were at work earning money that apparently funded her date nights. I laughed like a man who'd just realized he'd been cast as the comic relief in his own life story, like I'd been paying for my own humiliation in high definition, 1080p quality, with excellent lighting and composition. The couple next door stopped their furniture Olympics for a moment, probably wondering who was cackling like a supervillain at 3 in the morning in room 237. It was me. I was the villain origin story happening in real time. My phone immediately started ringing. Heather. I answered on the second ring because at this point, why not? The night was already a disaster. Might as well lean into it. Ryan? Oh God, you saw them. Her voice was frantic, guilty, like she'd just told a kid that Santa wasn't real and also his dog ran away. I saw them. I confirmed, my voice surprisingly steady. All of them. The dog, the ex-boyfriend, the restaurant that I'm guessing I paid for through our joint account since she hasn't had a job in 8 months. I'm so sorry, Heather said, and she actually sounded like she meant it, which was more than I could say for anyone else in her family. I found out 2 days ago. I was over at Mom's house, and Marissa left her phone on the counter. I wasn't snooping, I swear, but she got a text from Trent, and it was right there on the lock screen, and it said something about last night was amazing, and I could not look, you know. How long? I asked, because apparently I was a glutton for punishment. How long has this been going on? From what I could tell from the messages, about 3 months, maybe longer. The photos with Trent go back to July. Heather paused, and I could hear her taking a breath like she was preparing to drop another bomb. Ryan, she's been seeing him behind your back. Multiple times. Restaurants, his apartment. Even that weekend she said she was going to visit her college friend in Portland. She was with him. Portland. The trip I'd encouraged her to take because I thought she needed time with friends. The trip I'd given her $200 for gas money. The trip I'd spent alone in our house, eating cereal for dinner and catching up on laundry, being a supportive husband while she was apparently in a hotel room with Trent doing things I didn't want to think about. And your mom knows, I said. Not a question. A statement. Mom knows, Heather confirmed, her voice tight with anger. She's known for at least a month. Maybe longer. She thinks it's fine because, and I quote, Marissa deserves to be happy, and if that means exploring her options, then that's what modern marriage is about. Modern marriage. I repeated slowly, like I was tasting the words and finding them rotten. Is that what we're calling cheating now? Exploring options? Mom's logic doesn't make sense on the best days, Heather said. This isn't even close to her best day. She was probably the one encouraging Marissa to see Trent. She never liked you, Ryan. No offense. None taken, I said, which was true. Judith's dislike of me had been so obvious from day one that it would have been more offensive if she'd pretended otherwise. Let me guess, she was probably the one holding the ring light for those selfies, giving direction like a discount photographer. Turn left, darling. Show more teeth. Make sure the betrayal really pops in the frame. Heather actually laughed, which made me feel slightly better about the entire situation. Honestly, probably. She's been Team Trent since college. She never shut up about how he came from a good family and had prospects. You know what that means? Yeah, I said. Money. It means money and the kind of job title that sounds impressive at dinner parties. Exactly. Heather sighed, and I could picture her on the other end of the phone, probably sitting in her apartment with her 3 cats, surrounded by the kind of organized chaos that social media managers seem to thrive in. I know this is a lot to process, and I'm sorry I had to be the one to tell you, but I couldn't just sit on this information. You're a good guy, Ryan. You deserve better than this. Better than being compared to a dog I apparently have to compete with for my wife's affection? I asked. Low bar, but I appreciate the sentiment. We talked for another 20 minutes, Heather filling in details that I simultaneously needed and hated hearing. How Marissa had been deleting messages. How she'd created a hidden folder on her phone specifically for photos with Trent. How the whole family had been walking on eggshells around the situation because nobody wanted to be the one to tell me. When we finally hung up, I sat there in the orange glow of the parking lot lights, my phone full of evidence, my marriage clearly over, and my pride somewhere in the vicinity of the motel's broken ice machine. The wall cat made a noise that sounded sympathetic, which probably meant I'd officially hit rock bottom, when you're getting emotional support from alleged feline infrastructure. But here's the weird thing. I felt relieved. Genuinely, honestly relieved. Because now I knew. Now it all made sense. And now I could stop wondering why my wife flinched when I touched her, or why she always had an excuse not to spend time together. It wasn't me. It was never me. It was her, and Trent, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a mother-in-law who thought betrayal was just modern marriage. And honestly, they could have each other. Morning came whether I wanted it to or not. Which is the problem with mornings. They just show up like that one friend who doesn't understand social cues. The sun rose over the Sunset Vista Motel in all its mediocre glory, streaming through the inadequate curtains and hitting me directly in the face like nature's way of saying, get up and deal with your problems. You can't hide in this $49 room forever. The wall cat had gone silent. The Olympic furniture movers next door had finally exhausted themselves, and I was awake with approximately 2 hours of sleep, a phone full of incriminating evidence, and the kind of righteous anger that only comes from discovering your wife has been living a double life while you've been working doubles to pay for it. I took a shower in the bathroom that was so small I had to step out to change my mind, using the tiny soap bar that was wrapped in paper so thin it was basically a suggestion of soap. The water pressure fluctuated between gentle mist and fire hose trying to kill you, with no middle ground whatsoever. But standing there underwater that couldn't decide what temperature it wanted to be, I had a moment of absolute clarity that felt almost spiritual, if spirituality could happen in a motel bathroom that smelled like mildew and broken dreams. I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the kind of lawyer who'd seen every variation of marital disaster and could navigate through this mess with the kind of professional detachment that I currently couldn't muster because I was still processing the fact that my wife had made out with our dog and documented it like it was a milestone worth celebrating. After getting dressed in yesterday's clothes because, again, I'd forgotten to pack underwear in my dramatic exit, I did what every heartbroken, over-caffeinated man in the 21st century does when facing a legal crisis. I Googled. Specifically, I Googled cheap divorce lawyer who takes vengeance seriously, which in retrospect was probably not the best search query, but at 7 in the morning running on 2 hours of sleep and the existential dread of being cheated on, my SEO skills were not exactly at their peak. The search results were a mix of law firms with names like Jacobson and Associates and Miller Legal Group. All very professional, all very expensive looking, all featuring stock photos of people in suits shaking hands in front of bookshelves filled with impressively thick legal volumes that probably nobody had actually read since 1987. But then, buried on page 2 of the results, because apparently even in my crisis, I was thorough enough to go to page 2 of Google, which is basically the digital equivalent of looking in the couch cushions. I found a listing for Lawson Legal Services, honest representation for honest people. The website looked like it had been designed in 2003 and never updated, which either meant the lawyer was ancient or didn't care about digital marketing, and honestly, both options seemed fine to me. There was a phone number, an address on the less fancy side of downtown, and a tagline that said 30 years of fighting for what's right. The photo showed a man who looked like he'd been personally overseeing divorces since the Civil War, with more wrinkles than a Shar-Pei and eyes that suggested he'd heard every excuse, every lie, and every sob story that humanity could produce. I called the number, half expecting an answering machine or a receptionist who'd tell me the earliest appointment was in 6 weeks. Instead, a gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Lawson Legal Services, this is Lawson. Hi. Mr. Lawson. I started, suddenly realizing I hadn't actually prepared what I was going to say. I need a divorce lawyer. Quickly. As quickly as possible because my wife has been cheating on me with her ex-boyfriend and also possibly our dog. And I just found out last night. And I'm currently in a motel room that might have a cat living in the walls. And I really need to talk to someone who can help me not lose everything in this disaster. There was a pause. A long pause. The kind of pause that makes you think maybe you've said too much and scared off the only lawyer willing to answer his own phone at 7:30 in the morning. Then, son, you sound like you've had a hell of a night. Can you be here in an hour? I could have kissed him. I didn't, because that would have been weird, and also I was trying to cut down on inappropriate kissing after last night's revelations. But the sentiment was there. The office was located in a 3-story brick building that had character, which is what people say about buildings that are old but haven't fallen down yet. The directory in the lobby listed a bail bondsman on the first floor, a tax accountant who apparently only worked during tax season on the second floor, and Lawson Legal Services on the third floor, which I reached via an elevator that moved so slowly I legitimately considered taking the stairs halfway through the ride. The office itself was exactly what the website had promised: functional, honest, and completely unconcerned with impressing anyone. The waiting area had chairs from the 70s, magazines from the 90s, and a receptionist desk that was currently unoccupied, though there was a note that said back at 9 a.m., Dorothy. There was a coffee maker in the corner that looked like it had survived several wars and was still producing coffee out of spite and determination. You must be Ryan, said a voice from the doorway to the inner office, and there stood Mr. Lawson himself, looking exactly like his website photo except more three-dimensional. He was probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair that he'd given up trying to tame, a suit that had seen better decades but was clean and pressed, and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent 30 years listening to people's problems and had developed a very specific set of facial expressions for each category of human disaster. That's me, I said, standing up and shaking his hand, which had the grip of someone who'd been doing manual labor before becoming a lawyer and never forgot where he came from. Come on in. Coffee, please, I said, following him into an office that was packed with filing cabinets, law books, and the kind of organized chaos that suggested a brilliant mind that had better things to do than worry about feng shui. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that looked like it had been brewing since dawn, handed me one, and settled into his chair behind a desk that was covered in files, legal pads, and a nameplate that said Thomas Lawson, attorney at law, in letters that were starting to fade. So, he said, pulling out a legal pad and clicking a pen that looked older than I was. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Take your time. I've heard worse, I promise you. So I told him. Everything. The conversation I'd overheard, the dramatic exit, the motel, the messages from Marissa, the photos from Heather, the 3-month affair with Trent, the Portland trip, the joint account that had funded my own humiliation, and yes, even the thing with the dog, because at this point, what was the point of leaving out details? Mr. Lawson took notes, his pen moving across the legal pad in shorthand that probably only he could read, occasionally nodding or making small noises of acknowledgement. When I finished, he set down his pen, took a sip of his coffee, and looked at me with eyes that had definitely seen worse. Son, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of legal experience, you don't need revenge. You need paperwork. I blinked. Paperwork. Paperwork, he confirmed, leaning back in his chair. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is messy. Revenge gets you in trouble and costs you money. Paperwork is clean. Paperwork is legal. Paperwork gets you out of this marriage with your dignity and your assets intact, and it makes her pay for what she's done within the boundaries of the law. He pulled out a fresh legal pad and started making a list, explaining as he went. First, we file for divorce on grounds of adultery. That's easy. You've got photo evidence, which is basically a gift from the gods of family law. Second, we document every transaction from that joint account. You said she hasn't worked in 8 months? 8 months, I confirmed. She said she was finding herself and needed time to explore her passions. Well, she certainly explored something, Mr. Lawson said dryly. Did she explore it using marital funds? The joint account, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the banking app. I can see the transactions. Restaurants, spa days, boutique shopping, even a $300 dog grooming session. Mr. Lawson's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. If that kid was a seasoned divorce attorney who'd just been handed leverage. Oh, this is good. This is very good. If she's been using marital funds to finance her affair, we can make her reimburse you for that. Plus, depending on how your assets are structured, we might be able to argue for a favorable division based on her adultery and misuse of shared resources. So the dog gets visitation, but she gets the bill? I asked, because apparently, even in serious legal consultations, my brain defaulted to sarcasm as a coping mechanism. Mr. Lawson grinned, and it was the kind of grin that suggested he'd been waiting his entire career for a client who appreciated the irony of divorce law. Now you're thinking like a client I can respect. We spent the next hour going through everything: my rights, her potential claims, the division of assets, the timeline for filing, what to expect in court, and how to protect myself financially while the divorce was pending. Mr. Lawson explained everything in plain English. None of that legal jargon that makes you feel like you need a law degree just to understand what you're signing. My retainer is $1,500, he said finally, sliding a contract across the desk. That covers the initial filing and the first month of work. After that, we bill hourly, but I'm honest about my hours. I don't charge you for thinking about your case while I'm getting groceries. You'll get itemized statements, and if you have questions, you call me. That's what you're paying for. I looked at the contract, at this man who'd listened to my story without judgment, who'd offered me coffee and clarity, who'd made me feel like maybe this disaster had a path forward that didn't involve me living in a motel room forever. Where do I sign? I asked. Leaving Mr. Lawson's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in approximately 16 hours. Purpose. Not happiness, not relief, not even satisfaction, but purpose, which is what happens when you channel raw emotional devastation into a productive task that involves spreadsheets and a lawyer who looks like he's personally witnessed the fall of Rome. I had a mission now, a quest, a legitimate reason to dive headfirst into the digital paper trail of my failed marriage and emerge victorious with evidence that would hold up in court and also potentially be useful for a very depressing scrapbook that I would never actually make but enjoyed imagining. The first order of business, according to Mr. Lawson's carefully written instructions on his ancient legal pad, was to gather and organize all evidence of Marissa's extracurricular activities. This meant screenshots, bank statements, credit card bills, text messages, emails, photos, and basically anything that could prove what she'd been doing while I was at the warehouse moving boxes and believing I was in a functional marriage. He'd told me to be thorough, be organized, and for the love of God, don't delete anything accidentally, because digital evidence was only useful if it still existed. I returned to the Sunset Vista Motel, my temporary command center, my fortress of solitude, my $49 a night headquarters for Operation Document Everything, and set up shop. I grabbed the wobbly nightstand, dragged it next to the bed, plugged in my phone charger, and opened my laptop, which I'd thankfully had the presence of mind to grab during my dramatic exit along with my collection of mismatched socks and zero underwear. The laptop was a 5-year-old Dell that made concerning whirring noises whenever I asked it to do more than one thing at a time, but it had a working keyboard and could access the internet, which made it more reliable than my marriage. I started with the joint bank account, logging in with credentials that suddenly felt like archaeological artifacts from a previous era when I trusted the person I shared finances with. The account history loaded slowly, my laptop whirring like it was trying to achieve flight, and then there it was, Months of transactions, laid out in neat little rows with dates and amounts and merchant names that told a story more compelling than most Netflix documentaries. Let me tell you something about bank statements. They don't lie. They can't lie. They're just numbers and dates and the cold, hard truth of where money went and why. And looking at our joint account history was like reading a mystery novel where the detective is an idiot who didn't notice all the obvious clues because he was too busy working overtime to afford the clues in the first place. June 15th, Giovanni's Italian restaurant, $147. I was working that night. I specifically remembered because we'd gotten a massive shipment of industrial parts that took until midnight to process. June 22nd, Serenity Day Spa, $230. She told me she was going to the library to research freelance opportunities. July 3rd, Nordstrom, $312. The blue dress. The same blue dress she'd worn in the photo with Trent. I'd complimented that dress. She'd smiled and said she'd found it on clearance. $312 is not clearance unless you're shopping in a dimension where money means something completely different. July 18th, Pooch Paradise Premium Grooming, $308. $308 for dog grooming. I'd had the same haircut for 4 years that cost $18 including tip, but Biscuit apparently needed the platinum package with aromatherapy and a massage. The dog got a spa day that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The irony was so thick I could have used it as insulation. I started taking screenshots of everything, organizing them into folders on my laptop with names like restaurant receipts, shopping sprees, dog-related financial crimes, and my personal favorite, evidence that I've been funding my own humiliation. Each screenshot got saved, backed up to the cloud, and then backed up again to an external hard drive because Mr. Lawson had looked me dead in the eye and said, "Technology fails. Back up everything twice. 3 times if you're paranoid. Be paranoid." The credit card statements were even more illuminating, like someone had taken a highlighter to all of my wife's lies and color-coded them by category of betrayal. There were charges at stores I'd never heard of, restaurants and neighborhoods she'd claimed to never visit, and my personal favorite discovery, a hotel charge from the Portland weekend. The Extended Stay America in Portland, Oregon. Except here's the plot twist that made me laugh so hard the wall cat got concerned. The charge was for 2 nights, but she'd told me she was staying with her college friend Sarah for 4 days. I pulled up my old text with Marissa from that weekend, scrolling back through messages that now read like a comedy script written by someone with a cruel sense of humor. Having so much fun with Sarah. We went to Powell's bookstore today. Sarah says hi. Every message was a lie. Every enthusiastic text was her probably typing it while lying next to Trent in a hotel room that I'd helped pay for through our joint account. I screenshot everything. Every text, every receipt, every credit card charge, every bank statement. I became a digital forensics expert, a spreadsheet warrior, a man on a mission fueled by instant coffee and the kind of focused anger that comes from realizing you've been cast as the comic relief in someone else's romance. The instant coffee, by the way, came from the motel's vending machine after I discovered that the in-room coffee maker produced a substance that couldn't legally be called coffee in most states. I'd bought 6 packets of instant espresso for $2 each, which was highway robbery, but at this point, I needed the caffeine more than I needed financial responsibility. I mixed it with hot water from the bathroom tap, which I know sounds disgusting, and you're absolutely right, it was disgusting, but desperate times call for desperate measures and questionable beverage choices. By noon, I had compiled a digital dossier that would have made a private investigator proud. I had spreadsheets. I had timelines. I had a folder labeled Exhibit A, Dog Better Than Me, that contained not only the infamous biscuit kissing photo, but also a breakdown of every penny spent on that dog's luxury lifestyle, while I'd been eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch to save money. I even cross-referenced Marissa's credit card charges with her text messages to me, creating a side-by-side comparison that showed exactly where she'd actually been versus where she'd claimed to be. It was damning. It was thorough. It was the kind of evidence that Mr. Lawson would probably frame and put on his wall as an example of excellent client preparation. My phone buzzed with more messages from Marissa, each one more frantic than the last. I ignored them all and added screenshots of the messages themselves to my evidence folder, because apparently, She hadn't figured out that continuing to text your estranged husband while he's building a legal case against you is probably not the best strategy. But then again, this was the same woman who documented her affair in photos and saved them to her phone, so strategic thinking clearly wasn't her strong suit. Around 2 in the afternoon, I realized I needed to go back to work. Not just because I needed the money, though I definitely needed the money, especially now that I was paying for motel rooms and lawyer retainers, but because I needed the normalcy. I needed to lift boxes and scan barcodes and exist in a space where people weren't betraying me, and the biggest drama was whether the forklift would start on the first try. I showed up for my shift at Morrison's warehouse at 3 o'clock, still wearing yesterday's clothes because I still hadn't solved the underwear situation, but at least I'd showered and no longer smelled like industrial metal and existential crisis. My supervisor, Rick, was doing inventory near the loading dock, checking off items on a clipboard and looking exactly as thrilled about it as anyone looks when doing inventory on a Thursday afternoon. Rick was one of those middle-aged guys who'd been working at the warehouse since the 90s and had achieved a level of Zen-like acceptance about it. He had 3 kids, a wife who worked as a nurse, a mortgage on a house in the suburbs, and the kind of stable, boring life that I'd thought I was building toward before everything imploded. He was good people, the kind of supervisor who remembered your birthday and didn't write you up if you were 5 minutes late because your car was acting up. "Ryan," he said when he saw me, checking his watch with exaggerated concern. "You're early. Are you feeling okay? Did something happen? Is this a cry for help?" "I'm going through a divorce," I said, grabbing my time card and clocking in. "Turns out my wife's been cheating on me with her ex-boyfriend and also possibly our dog. I'm currently living in a motel room that costs $49 a night and might have structural cats. How's your day going?" Rick blinked at me, his pen frozen mid-checklist. What? "Yeah," I said, heading toward my station. "It's been a week, and it's only Thursday." I spent the next 4 hours loading trucks, organizing shipments, and humming. Actually humming. Like a cartoon character who'd just won the lottery, except instead of winning money, I'd won the freedom to leave a relationship that had been dead for months, and I'd just been too stupid or too hopeful to notice. I hummed while I lifted boxes. I hummed while I drove the forklift. I hummed while I wrapped pallets in plastic sheeting that always somehow managed to stick to itself in the most annoying ways possible. Rick found me around hour 3 of my shift, stacking boxes of industrial supplies with what must have looked like suspicious enthusiasm. "Okay, man, I have to ask," he said, leaning against a support beam and watching me work like I was a documentary about human behavior. "Are you okay? Like, actually okay? Because you just told me you're getting divorced and living in a motel, but you're humming show tunes while stacking 50-pound boxes. That's either really healthy coping or you've completely snapped. I need to know which one so I can decide whether to be supportive or concerned." I set down the box I was holding and turned to face him, wiping sweat off my forehead with my shirt sleeve. "You want the honest answer?" "Always. I feel better than I have in months," I said. "Yeah, my marriage is over. Yeah, I'm sleeping in a room that Abraham Lincoln haunts via ceiling stain. Yeah, my wife preferred making out with our Labrador over spending time with me. But you know what? Now I know. Now it makes sense. And now I can move forward instead of wondering why nothing I do is ever good enough for someone who is never going to be satisfied anyway." Rick nodded slowly, processing this information. "So you're okay?" "I'm better than okay," I said. "I'm free. And also extremely well documented. I have spreadsheets, Rick. Color-coded spreadsheets." "You're weird," he said, but he was smiling. "Divorced weird," I corrected, picking up another box. "There's a difference." He shook his head and walked away, muttering something about needing to update the employee wellness protocols. Mr. Lawson called me on Friday morning while I was attempting to make the motel's coffee maker produce something that resembled actual coffee rather than the brown liquid sadness it had been generating. His voice came through my phone speaker with that particular tone lawyers use when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear, but legally have to do anyway. "Ryan, I need you to go back to the house," he said, not even bothering with pleasantries because we'd moved past the stage of our attorney-client relationship where we pretended this situation wasn't absolutely insane. "I know you don't want to. I know it's going to be uncomfortable. But legally, you need to establish that you haven't abandoned the property. Abandonment can complicate things in divorce proceedings, especially regarding asset division. So I have to go back to the scene of the crime, I said, watching the coffee maker sputter and wheeze like it was trying to communicate in Morse code. The place where I discovered my wife thinks I'm less attractive than a Labrador retriever. That house, Mr. Lawson confirmed. You don't have to stay there. You don't even have to stay longer than an hour. But you need to go in, establish presence, preferably grab some more of your belongings, and make it clear you're not abandoning your legal claim to the property. Think of it as a strategic visit, not a homecoming. Can I bill this as emotional labor? I asked, because I feel like facing your soon-to-be ex-wife after she spent 3 months cheating on you and comparing you to household pets should count as overtime. Unfortunately, the legal system doesn't compensate for emotional distress in quite that way, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But think of it this way. Every minute you spend in that house is a minute you're protecting your financial interests. Very expensive minutes, if you calculate what the house is worth. He had a point. Our rental wasn't much, but we'd sunk money into it. Security deposit, first and last month's rent, furniture we'd bought together, appliances we'd upgraded when the landlord's ancient refrigerator finally gave up and died. I had a legal right to that space and everything in it, and I wasn't about to let Marissa's betrayal cost me more than it already had. So that's how I found myself pulling into the driveway of our beige house at 11 o'clock on a Friday morning. My Honda Civic making its usual dying robot noises, my stomach doing acrobatics that would have impressed Olympic gymnasts. The house looked exactly the same as it had 3 days ago, which was somehow offensive. It should have looked different. It should have had a sign out front that said site of marital disaster, or maybe beware, emotional hazard. But no, it just sat there being aggressively beige and ordinary, like it hadn't been the location of my complete humiliation. I sat in the car for a solid 5 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the front door like it was going to suddenly sprout teeth and eat me. Through the living room window, I could see movement. Marissa was home, probably lounging on the couch we'd bought from a going-out-of-business sale, drinking wine at 11 in the morning like some kind of suburban stereotype come to life. Strategic visit, I muttered to myself. Establishing presence. Protecting financial interests. You've got spreadsheets and a lawyer. You can do this. I got out of the car, walked up to the front door, and used my key, because technically I still lived here, even if I'd been sleeping in a motel room that Abraham Lincoln's ceiling stain had blessed with his presence. The door opened with that same creak that the landlord still hadn't fixed, and I stepped into the entryway that smelled like the candle Marissa always burned, the one called Autumn Harvest, that mostly just smelled like someone had set pumpkins on fire. Marissa was exactly where I'd seen her through the window, on the couch, wine glass in hand, wearing sweatpants and one of my old college t-shirts, which felt like adding insult to injury. She looked up when I walked in, and her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, guilt, defiance, and then something that looked like she'd rehearsed in the mirror: wounded innocence. "Ryan," she said, setting down her wine glass with exaggerated care, like she was performing in a play about estranged couples and had studied method acting. "You're back." Legally mandated appearance, I said, keeping my voice level and detached, the way Mr. Lawson had coached me. "I'm here to collect some belongings and establish that I haven't abandoned the property. Don't worry, I'm not moving back in. Your wine and your judgment are safe." She stood up, and I noticed she'd been crying, or at least wanted me to think she'd been crying. Her eyes were red. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that was either artfully disheveled or genuinely disheveled, and she had that look that women get when they're about to deploy tears as a strategic weapon. "It was a joke," she said, her voice cracking just enough to be noticeable. "What I said to my mom about you and the dog, it was just a stupid joke. You know how Mom and I are when we get together. We say things we don't mean. We were drinking, and she was venting about her own marriage, and I was just being supportive, and it came out wrong." I stared at her, genuinely amazed at the audacity. "A joke," I repeated slowly, like I was learning a new language and needed to make sure I understood the vocabulary. "You told your mother you'd rather kiss our dog than sleep with your husband." She laughed like it was the punchline to a comedy special, "and your defense is that it was a joke." "Yes." She stepped forward, reaching for my hand, which I immediately moved out of reach. "Ryan, please. I didn't mean it. I love you. We can work through this." "Then the dog must have loved it too," I said, moving past her toward the bedroom. The joke, I mean. I'm sure Biscuit found it hilarious. I walked into our bedroom. Well, technically still our bedroom, though it hadn't felt like hours in months, and grabbed my duffel bag from the closet. I started pulling clothes off hangers, actually taking the time to grab underwear this time, because I'd learned my lesson about dramatic exits and proper packing. Marissa followed me, hovering in the doorway like a ghost who couldn't decide whether to haunt or apologize. "Where are you staying?" she asked, her voice smaller now, less performance and more genuine confusion. "Ryan, you can't just leave. We're married. We have a life together." "Had?" I corrected, grabbing socks from the dresser drawer. "Had a life together. Past tense. Until I discovered that life was a fiction you were maintaining while living a completely different reality." "What are you talking about?" The confusion seemed real, or she was a better actress than I'd given her credit for. I stopped packing and turned to face her directly. And this was the moment I'd been simultaneously dreading and anticipating since Mr. Lawson had told me I needed to make this visit. "I know about Trent." The effect was immediate and spectacular. Her jaw literally dropped, like someone had cut the strings holding it in place. The color drained from her face so quickly I was briefly concerned she might actually faint, which would have been inconvenient because I didn't want to deal with medical emergencies on top of everything else. Who told you about Trent?" She managed to stammer, which was basically a confession wrapped in a question wrapped in panic. "Does it matter?" I asked, continuing to pack. "Your sister, your credit card statements, the photos, the restaurant receipts from places I paid for through our joint account. Take your pick. The evidence is pretty overwhelming, and I have to say, Marissa, you're not as good at covering your tracks as you think you are." The Portland trip was particularly sloppy. She sat down on the bed, our bed, the one we bought together 3 years ago during a Memorial Day sale, and put her head in her hands. For a moment, I thought she might actually be processing the reality of getting caught, maybe even feeling genuine remorse. Then she looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "It's not what you think." I actually laughed, out loud, a genuine bark of laughter that surprised both of us. "It's not what I think. Marissa, I have photos of you kissing him. I have bank statements showing you've been funding dates with him using money from our joint account. I have text messages. I have a timeline. I have a color-coded spreadsheet. What part of this isn't what I think? It just happened," she said, which is what people always say when they want to pretend they weren't active participants in their own choices. "Trent reached out to me a few months ago, and we started talking, and it just happened. For 3 months," I said. "It just happened for 3 months. It just happened through multiple restaurant dates, hotel stays, and a weekend trip to Portland. That's not just happening, Marissa. That's a relationship. That's a choice you made repeatedly, while I was working doubles to support us, while I was being a faithful husband, while I was apparently competing with both your ex-boyfriend and our dog for your affection." She flinched at the dog reference, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities and her shame. That photo was taken out of context. There is no context where making out with a Labrador retriever makes sense. I zipped up my duffel bag with more force than necessary. "But you know what? It doesn't matter anymore. You can kiss whoever or whatever you want. I'm done." I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but stopped in the doorway and turned back one more time. "Just so we're clear, my lawyer has all the evidence. All of it. The affair, the joint account expenses, everything. If you try to take me for everything in this divorce, it's not going to work out the way you think it will." Her face went from sad to angry in record time, like someone had flipped a switch. "Your lawyer? You already got a lawyer? We could have talked about this like adults." "We tried that," I said calmly. "On Wednesday, remember? Right before you compared me to a dog. That was me trying to talk like an adult. This is me protecting myself from someone who clearly stopped caring about this marriage months ago." I walked out, loaded my duffel bag into my car, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting my hands shake from the adrenaline that had been holding itself together during the confrontation. I'd done it. I'd gone back, established presence, collected my belongings, and survived the encounter without breaking down or saying anything I'd regret. My phone rang about an hour later, right as I was pulling back into the Sunset Vista Motel's parking lot. Unknown number, which I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick up. Probably the same instinct that told me to check my wife's hidden photos. The instinct that knows when the universe has more disaster to deliver. Ryan. Judith's voice came through the speaker like a guillotine wrapped in false politeness. We need to talk about what you're doing to this family. Mrs. Henderson, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I'm not doing anything to this family. I'm removing myself from it. You're destroying us, she practically shrieked, abandoning any pretense of civility. Marissa is devastated. She made a mistake, and instead of being a man about it and forgiving her, you're running to lawyers and threatening everything we've built. Everything we've built. I repeated, genuinely confused. What exactly did we build? Because from where I'm standing, I built a marriage while your daughter built a side relationship and you encouraged it. How dare you? Ma'am, I interrupted, and I realized I was smiling, actually smiling during this conversation. The family destroyed itself somewhere between the wine glasses and the dog shampoo fund. I'm just the guy who finally noticed and decided to stop paying for it. I hung up before she could respond, blocked the number, and walked into my motel room feeling lighter than I had in months. The divorce papers were filed on a Monday morning, which felt poetic in a way that only people going through legal dissolution of their marriage can appreciate. Mondays are already universally hated, so why not add some official documentation of your failed relationship to really lean into the misery? Mr. Lawson had prepared everything with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made me understand why he'd been doing this for 30 years and hadn't burned out or developed a drinking problem that I knew of. The papers were comprehensive, brutal in their honesty, and cited adultery with enough supporting evidence that I'm pretty sure we could have taught a law school class on proper documentation of infidelity. The process server delivered them to Marissa on a Tuesday afternoon, while she was presumably at home doing whatever people who don't have jobs do during the day. I wasn't there to witness it, obviously, because I was at work stacking boxes and living my best recently separated life, but I got a text notification from Mr. Lawson's office that said, papers served successfully at 2:47 p.m., with a level of professional satisfaction that made me want to high-five everyone in the warehouse. Marissa's response came approximately 11 minutes later, which told me she'd either speed read through 15 pages of legal documentation or, more likely, had seen the words petition for dissolution of marriage on the first page and immediately gone into panic mode without reading the rest. My phone buzzed with a text that was trying so hard to sound reasonable and mature that it actually achieved the opposite effect. Ryan, this is insane. Can't we talk about this like adults? We don't need lawyers and court dates. We can work this out ourselves. Please. I stared at that message for a good 30 seconds, sitting in my car during my lunch break, eating a sandwich I'd made that morning in the motel room using bread, turkey, and the determination of a man who'd learned that restaurant food was expensive and I had legal fees to pay. The audacity of that text was impressive, really. The sheer nerve it took to ask if we could talk like adults after everything that had happened. I typed back with the kind of concise clarity that comes from having absolutely no patience left for manipulation. We tried that. You chose the dog. I watched the 3 dots appear, disappear, appear again, disappear again, like she was typing and deleting responses in real time, probably cycling through various manipulation tactics and trying to figure out which one would work. Eventually, she gave up, and the dots disappeared for good. I finished my sandwich in peace, which tasted better than any meal I'd eaten in the last 4 years of marriage, and went back to work feeling like I'd won a small but significant victory. The settlement meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later, which gave both sides time to prepare their cases, review finances, and presumably practice their courtroom faces in the mirror. It was held in a conference room at the county courthouse that smelled like old wood, stale coffee, and the accumulated disappointment of thousands of divorces that had happened before ours. The room had a long table, uncomfortable chairs that seemed designed to make you want to settle quickly just so you could leave, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely ill, which felt appropriate for the occasion. Mr. Lawson arrived first, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived several wars and possibly a natural disaster. Wearing the same suit he'd worn to our first meeting, but with a different tie. This one had tiny scales of justice on it, which I appreciated for the commitment to theme. He set up his materials with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, arranging folders, legal pads, and pens in a specific configuration that probably meant something in lawyer language. Remember, he said to me quietly as we waited. Don't react emotionally to anything her lawyer says. Don't engage directly with Marissa. Let me do the talking. Your job is to sit there, look reasonable, and let me dismantle whatever nonsense they're going to try to pull. I can do that, I said. I've been practicing my reasonable person face in the motel bathroom mirror. How's that working out? The mirror cracked, but I think that was unrelated. He snorted, which I was learning was his version of a laugh. And then the door opened and Marissa walked in with her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who looked like she'd graduated from law school approximately 15 minutes ago and was trying very hard to project an air of competence that her baby face wasn't quite supporting. She wore a power suit that was slightly too big for her, carried a briefcase that looked brand new, and had the eager energy of someone who'd watched too many legal dramas and thought real courtroom proceedings involved dramatic music and surprise witnesses. Marissa, for her part, had clearly dressed for maximum sympathy points. She wore a simple dress that made her look vulnerable, minimal makeup that somehow emphasized that she'd been crying, and had her hair styled in a way that suggested innocent victim rather than person who cheated on her husband for 3 months and documented it like a scrapbooking project. She didn't look at me when she sat down, which was fine because I was looking at a spot on the wall just past her left shoulder and pretending she was furniture. The mediator, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Gerald, who'd probably presided over more failed marriages than a divorce-themed amusement park, called the meeting to order with all the enthusiasm of someone reading assembly instructions for furniture. We're here to discuss the dissolution of marriage between Ryan Cooper and Marissa Cooper, previously Marissa Henderson, Gerald said, reading from a file. Both parties have legal representation. Let's start with asset division and work our way through the issues. Ms. Hendricks, you filed a preliminary request for spousal support and assumption of shared debts by Mr. Cooper. Would you like to present your case? Patricia Hendricks stood up, which seemed unnecessary since we were in a conference room and not a courtroom, but I guess she needed the theatrical moment. She opened her folder with a flourish that would have been more impressive if some papers hadn't immediately fallen out, which she quickly gathered while pretending it hadn't happened. Your Honor, Mr. Gerald, she started, already fumbling, and I saw Mr. Lawson's lips twitch with suppressed amusement. My client has been financially dependent on Mr. Cooper throughout their marriage. She gave up career opportunities to support the household, and now finds herself in a precarious financial position through no fault of her own. No fault of her own, I muttered under my breath, and Mr. Lawson's hand moved subtly in a gesture that meant, shut up and let me work. Furthermore, Patricia continued, gaining confidence, there are significant credit card debts that were incurred during the marriage for household expenses and necessary purchases. We believe it's only fair that Mr. Cooper assume responsibility for 50% of these debts as they were accumulated during the marriage for mutual benefit. She slid a document across the table toward Mr. Lawson, who picked it up, glanced at it, and then did something I'll never forget. He pressed his lips together so hard they disappeared. His shoulders started shaking slightly, and I realized he was trying not to laugh. Actually laugh. In the middle of a settlement conference. He coughed, took a sip of water from the bottle he'd brought, and then set the paper down with the kind of careful control that suggested he was exercising every ounce of professional restraint he possessed. I'm sorry, Mr. Lawson said, his voice strained with suppressed laughter. I just need to clarify something. You're asking my client to assume 50% of debts that include. He pulled out his reading glasses and made a show of examining the document. $847 at a store called Dog Couture, $308 at Pooch Paradise Premium Grooming, and $216 at something called Bark and Bath Boutique? Patricia's confidence wavered. Those were household expenses. My client doesn't wear dog clothes, Mr. Lawson interrupted, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Unless I'm mistaken about his species, which I'm fairly confident I'm not. My client is not paying for canine accessories, luxury pet grooming, or whatever services are offered at establishments with bark in the name. The dog is part of the household. Patricia tried again. The dog, Mr. Lawson said, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining basic math to a particularly slow student, is not my client's responsibility anymore, seeing as he's divorcing his wife who, according to her own words that my client overheard, would rather kiss the dog than her husband. She can keep the dog. She can keep all the dog's couture. She can keep the grooming bills. What she cannot keep is any expectation that my client will fund her pet's lifestyle. Marissa's face had gone bright red, and she was staring at the table like she was trying to will herself into another dimension. Patricia looked at her client, then at the document, then back at Mr. Lawson, clearly realizing that her strategy of ask for everything and see what sticks was not going as planned. There are also restaurant expenses, Patricia started, but Mr. Lawson was already pulling out his own folder, this one significantly thicker and much more organized. Yes, let's talk about restaurant expenses, he said with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning. Specifically, let's talk about the $147 at Giovanni's Italian restaurant on June 15th, when my client was working a double shift at Morrison's warehouse. Or the $212 dinner at the River House on July 23rd, when my client was, again, at work. These restaurant expenses that were charged to the joint account while my client was earning the money that funded them were not household expenses. They were dates. Dates with, he consulted his notes with exaggerated care, Mr. Trent Morrison, Mrs. Cooper's ex-boyfriend, with whom she conducted an affair for approximately 3 months. The room went completely silent except for the humming of the fluorescent lights and what I'm pretty sure was Patricia Hendricks's professional dreams dying in real time. Gerald, the mediator, looked up from his notes with the first sign of actual interest he'd shown since the meeting started. Is there documentation of this affair? Extensive documentation, Mr. Lawson said, sliding a folder across the table that I knew contained copies of photos, text messages, and bank statements. Photos, text messages, credit card statements showing charges at hotels, restaurants, and other establishments. My client has been meticulous in his record keeping. By the time we finished going through every line item, every receipt, every piece of evidence that Marissa had spent marital funds on her affair, Patricia Hendricks looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and never practice law again. The requests for spousal support were withdrawn. The demands that I cover her credit card debt disappeared faster than common sense at a reality TV casting call. When it was all said and done, after 2 hours of negotiation that was really just Mr. Lawson systematically destroying every argument Patricia tried to make, I walked out of that courthouse with everything that mattered. My truck with its dying robot engine, my savings account that I'd been carefully protecting, and my sanity, which was somehow intact despite everything. Marissa kept the dog, the debt, and what I imagine was a very awkward conversation with her lawyer about why lying to your attorney is generally a bad strategy. Fair trade, I thought, getting into my Honda Civic and driving back to my motel room. Fair trade. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in September, which felt appropriately anticlimactic for something that had consumed 3 months of my life and approximately 30% of my mental capacity. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no judge banging a gavel while declaring us officially strangers, no orchestra swelling with emotional music in the background. It was just Gerald the mediator signing some papers, Mr. Lawson shaking my hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested he was proud of me in the way a coach is proud of an athlete who finally learned to stop tripping over their own feet, and me walking out of the courthouse into September sunshine feeling lighter than I had in years. I was officially single, officially free, officially no longer married to a woman who'd compared me to a Labrador retriever and then proceeded to prove that her judgment was even worse than that initial comparison suggested. The irony was that I actually felt grateful to Biscuit now. That dog had inadvertently shown me who I was married to, and in a weird way, I owed him a debt of gratitude and possibly some premium dog treats, though I wasn't going to be the one buying them anymore. The first order of business, according to Mr. Lawson's final advice given over handshakes and what I suspected was genuine fondness despite his professional detachment, was to get out of the Sunset Vista Motel before I either became a permanent fixture or the wall cat decided to make our relationship official. I'd been living there for 3 months, and while Abraham Lincoln's ceiling stain and I had developed a comfortable rapport, it was time to find actual housing that didn't charge by the night and didn't have alleged feline infrastructure. I'd been apartment hunting in my spare time between work shifts and legal proceedings, which turned out to be easier than expected because my requirements were refreshingly simple. For walls, a roof that didn't leak, a bathroom where all the fixtures worked simultaneously, in a location that wasn't more than 20 minutes from Morrison's warehouse. I wasn't asking for luxury. I was asking for basic functionality and the absence of judgment, which is apparently a low enough bar that I found a place within a week. The apartment was a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a building that had been constructed sometime in the 80s and had embraced that decade's aesthetic choices with concerning enthusiasm. The carpet was beige, because apparently I couldn't escape beige no matter how hard I tried. And the kitchen had linoleum flooring in a pattern that looked like someone had spilled a box of crayons and decided to make it permanent. But the rent was $650 a month, utilities included, and the landlord was a 70-year-old woman named Margaret who'd asked exactly 2 questions during my application. Do you pay on time? And are you going to throw parties that wake me up? When I'd answered yes to the first and no to the second, she'd handed me the keys and told me I was her favorite tenant already. The apartment was empty when I got the keys, which made sense because I owned approximately nothing after the divorce settlement. Marissa had kept all the furniture we'd bought together, partly because she'd insisted on it during negotiations, and partly because I genuinely didn't want any of it. Every couch cushion, every coffee table, every lamp had memories attached to it like barnacles on a ship, and I wanted to start fresh without the ghost of my failed marriage sitting on the second-hand love seat we'd bought from Craigslist. So I did what any newly divorced man with a promotion, a modest savings account, and a desperate need for furniture does. I went to IKEA on a Saturday morning and bought the bare essentials. A bed frame, a mattress that came rolled up like a burrito and expanded when you opened it, which felt like a metaphor for my life. A small couch that the display model promised was perfect for urban living, which is IKEA code for you'll fit on it if you're not too tall or too optimistic. A kitchen table with 2 chairs because I was done pretending I needed seating for guests I never had. Some plates, silverware, a couple of pots and pans, and a coffee maker that looked like it could actually produce coffee instead of the brown regret liquid the motel had specialized in. The total came to $947, which was less than Marissa had spent on dog accessories in 3 months. And that thought made me smile, while the cashier rang up my Swedish meatballs and furniture that required assembly and an engineering degree. I'd mentioned my move to Rick during a shift at the warehouse, not making a big deal out of it, just casual conversation while we were reorganizing the shipping area. Rick had immediately volunteered himself and Jamie, another warehouse worker who I'd become friendly with over the past few months, to help me move, which was generous considering I owned so little that moving basically meant transporting IKEA boxes and the contents of 1 duffel bag. They showed up at my new apartment on Sunday morning in Rick's pickup truck, which was significantly more reliable than my Honda Civic, and also had a working radio that didn't occasionally emit sounds like a robot having an existential crisis. Jamie brought coffee in actual to-go cups from an actual coffee shop, which immediately made her my favorite person in the greater metropolitan area. Jamie was in her late 20s, had been working at Morrison's for about 2 years, and had the kind of no-nonsense personality that came from being the oldest of 6 siblings and learning early that life doesn't care about your feelings, so you might as well laugh at it. She had bright red hair that she claimed was natural, but I suspected came from a bottle, a collection of tattoos that told stories she'd share if you bought her enough beer, and opinions about everything that she expressed with the confidence of someone who'd stopped caring what people thought around her 15th birthday. So this is the Fresh Start Palace, Jamie said, walking into my empty apartment and immediately testing the acoustics by yelling freedom at the top of her lungs. The echo was impressive. Nice. Very minimalist. Very. I'm starting over, and I've made peace with it. I approve. The landlord downstairs might not approve of the yelling, I said, but I was smiling because something about Jamie's energy was contagious. Margaret? Jamie asked. I passed her on the way up. She gave me a thumbs up. I think she likes me. Rick came in carrying a box marked Malm that presumably contained bed frame parts and tiny Allen wrenches that would definitely get lost before assembly was complete. Where do you want this? Bedroom, I suggested, because that seemed logical, though with IKEA furniture, logic was more of a guideline than a rule. We spent the next 3 hours assembling furniture, which turned into an adventure in Swedish engineering, questionable instructions, and the discovery that I had somehow ended up with 3 extra screws after building the bed frame. which either meant I was a genius who'd found efficiencies in the design or the bed was going to collapse at 3 in the morning and kill me. Rick insisted it was the former. Jamie bet $20 it was the latter and wanted to be notified immediately if I died. By 2 in the afternoon, my apartment looked almost like a place where humans lived. The bed was assembled and had sheets on it. The couch was arranged in front of where a TV would go once I could afford one. The kitchen table was set up near the window that overlooked the parking lot, which wasn't much of a view, but was better than the parking lot view I'd had at the motel, because this one didn't have a gas station advertising questionable hot dogs. Okay, Rick said, stepping back and surveying our work like a contractor admiring a completed project. This is officially a home. Bare bones, but functional. Now we celebrate. Celebrate how? I asked, because I didn't have any food in the apartment yet and wasn't sure what celebrating looked like in this context. Jamie pulled out her phone with a grin. We're getting fried chicken. Not the fancy kind. Not the organic free-range whatever kind. The greasy, delicious, probably terrible for you kind that comes in a bucket with biscuits and coleslaw. The kind of chicken that says, I've survived something difficult, and now I'm going to eat my feelings in the best possible way. 20 minutes later, we were sitting around my new kitchen table with a bucket of fried chicken from a place called Colonel's Best that was definitely not affiliated with any major chains, but made up for its legal ambiguity with genuinely excellent food. We also had beer. Rick had brought a 6-pack of some local IPA that he swore was life-changing. Though all beer tastes pretty similar when you're drinking it to celebrate freedom from a marriage that involved competing with a dog for affection. Here's to new beginnings, Jamie said, raising her beer bottle in a toast. And to leaving behind relationships that don't serve us, whether those relationships are with terrible spouses, judgmental in-laws, or apartments with alleged wall cats. To new beginnings, Rick echoed, clinking his bottle against Jamie's and then mine. And to dogs everywhere, I added, because apparently I couldn't let it go completely. May they only date within their species, and may their owners have better judgment than my ex-wife. We laughed, and it was real laughter, the kind that comes from your chest and feels genuine and warm. We ate fried chicken that was so greasy it probably violated several health codes, but tasted like victory and new starts. We drank beer that may or may not have been life-changing, but was certainly cold and refreshing. We sat in my nearly empty apartment with its beige carpet and questionable linoleum, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt at home. Not because the apartment was fancy or even particularly nice. Not because I had a lot of stuff or impressive furniture, but because I was surrounded by people who'd shown up for me without expecting anything in return, eating chicken that nobody was judging me for enjoying, in a space that was entirely mine and free from the weight of a relationship that had been dead long before I'd been brave enough to bury it. You doing okay? Rick asked after his third beer, looking at me with the kind of genuine concern that middle-aged fathers and decent supervisors specialize in. Like, actually okay? Because 3 months ago you were living in a motel after discovering your wife's greatest hits of betrayal, and now you're here starting over. That's a lot. I thought about it for a moment, genuinely considering the question instead of giving some automatic response. Was I okay? I was divorced. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment with barely any furniture and a bed that might be held together with hopes and dreams. I was eating fried chicken for dinner on a Sunday evening with my supervisor and a coworker instead of having some sophisticated adult meal with a spouse who respected me. Yeah, I said, and I meant it. Yeah, I'm actually okay. Better than okay. I'm free. Jamie smiled and grabbed another piece of chicken. Freedom tastes like fried chicken and cheap beer, apparently. Best meal I've had in years, I said. And honestly, it was. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few months. Work, apartment, sleep, repeat. Except now the routine felt like living instead of surviving. I got a promotion to shift supervisor, which came with a modest raise and the authority to tell people where to stack boxes, which was more satisfying than it should have been. That's when I ran into Clara Mitchell from HR, the accountant who'd always processed my overtime paychecks with a smile and occasionally made jokes about the warehouse's creative interpretation of safety regulations. We bumped into each other at a coffee shop near work on a Saturday morning. She was reading a book about financial planning, which should have been boring but somehow seemed charming when she explained she was trying to buy a house. Coffee? I asked, surprising myself with the boldness. Why not? She said. And that smile made me remember what it felt like to be interested in someone who might actually be interested back. We talked for 2 hours. She laughed at my terrible jokes, didn't compare me to any household pets, and when I mentioned I was divorced, she just nodded like it was information, not a character flaw. Progress, I thought. Definite progress. 6 months later, I got a text from an unknown number. It was short, bitter, unmistakably Marissa borrowing someone's phone, probably her mother's, since I'd blocked both of them months ago. I hope she's worth it. I looked at Clara sleeping on my couch, her head on my shoulder, some documentary about architecture playing on the TV I'd finally bought. We'd been dating for 3 months. She made me laugh. She paid for her own dinners. She'd never once mentioned my resemblance to any animals, domesticated or otherwise. I typed back, she is. She doesn't bark when I speak. Then I blocked the number and set my phone down. Clara stirred, looked up at me with sleepy eyes. Everything okay? Everything's perfect, I said, and meant it. That night, I thought about that first moment, my wife comparing me to a dog, the conversation that ended a marriage. The funny thing about dogs is they're loyal. Marissa never was. You can't compete with someone's ego when they're trying to train you like a pet. You just take off the leash, open the door, and walk yourself to freedom. Best decision I ever made.